Hi everyone and welcome to the Curious Geographer season, I think we're season 5, which is super exciting. So today's episode we are really lucky to be joined by Dr. Jazmin Scarlett, who is a historical and social volcanologist. Jazmin's research explores people's perceptions living close to volcanoes in the Caribbean, and some of the locations are chosen due to her personal connections, such as to St. Vincent, which we're going to be talking about later. Not only does Jazmin research volcanoes in the real world, but her interests have spanned also into her own interests, including video gaming, where Jazmin has actually conducted research on how volcanoes are displayed in video games, which is quite exciting. I think my screen might be frozen, but I think you can still hear me, which is fine, and I'll change that in a second. In 2001, Jazmin was awarded the President's Awards for the Geological Society of London, and she also hosts the podcast called What on Earth with Nuzhat, where they celebrate earth and environmental and planetary sciences from diverse backgrounds, and they talk about how we can decolonise these subjects. So I'm going to pass over to Jazmin. If you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit of an introduction whilst I sort out my camera. Yours is all working fine. If you wouldn't mind just letting us know a little bit about your research interests.
Yes, hello. So my name is Jazmin, and my background is actually in geography, and I've kind of eventually ended up into geology and the earth sciences. So I did my undergrad at Cambridge University in geography and natural hazards. Then went on to do a master's in volcanology and geological hazards at Lancaster University. And then I did a PhD in earth science at the University of Hull. And my research interests, the core of it is how do people live with volcanoes and their hazards. But it does kind of expand in general to how do people live with natural hazards. And there are different ways you can approach this. But for me, I wanted to combine my knowledge of how these physical processes work with how society lives with them and how they can live with them, or in some cases why they don't live with them. And so that expands to very diverge disciplines. So, for example, I use sociology, social psychology, anthropology, and historical geography, as well as kind of like the physical geography and physical geography, a little bit of physics, but not greatly. And it's just very diverse range, and I think that's what the beauty of it is, because you can kind of like take different angles, how you can understand how society and the environment mix together.
We're going to be talking about how you do kind of mix the different disciplines as well, which is so interesting, particularly when students kind of see geography as only kind of human and physical at school. Sometimes they just see it as geography. So we're going to talk about that in a second. But first of all, can we just talk about where you've kind of carried out research before? So you've carried out research in the Caribbean, in the island of St. Vincent, and this is a personal connection to you. Would you mind telling us a bit about why you like to research volcanic activity there?
Yes, so my family's from the Caribbean, in particular Jamaica and St. Vincent. While Jamaica, it is, geologically active, they have quite a lot of earthquakes. They don't have a volcano in it. So St. Vincent does have a volcano. It's one of the most active in the Caribbean. And essentially, the eruptions, the last two, and now third one. So in 1902, there's an eruption, and one in 1979. And that's still in living memory, and my family's passed on the stories of how they experienced those eruptions onto me, and that's what really captured my imagination. Because like, wow, I can't believe, like, it's a small island, like St. Vincent's is a tiny island, but it's got quite a big volcano in it. So I was really interested, well, how do they live with this volcano that's can be quite dangerous, and it has killed people in the past. And actually, it has erupted again. The eruption started last December and explosively erupted in April. And me personally, I never thought it would happen in my lifetime. So it was quite a unique experience. Even me being over in UK, still having an experience like, whoa, my research is coming alive in front of my eyes. So yeah, and I've also done research on Montserrat, so Soufriere Hills volcano, which erupted in the 90s up until the early 2000s. I've also done research in Europe, so there's extinct well, not extinct, but a volcano that erupted once near the end of last ice age in Germany, called the Lacasse. And it's this big crater lake now, essentially. And also researched the Vesuvius volcano in Italy, which was infamous for the 79 AD eruption that it caused. And I'm very much interested in the historical perspective, and of course, for the one that happened in the last ice age, that was a completely different angle to look at it, because I worked with an archaeologist, essentially, and that was a very interesting experience to go into the deep past to understand how basically hunter-gatherers got through this rather large volcanic eruption that happened in Germany.
That sounds so interesting, and particularly what I want to ask about now is, before you mentioned how you kind of use different disciplines, and you even said kind of anthropology. Now, some students might not know what anthropology is, so I was wondering if you could kind of mention what that is. So when you're actually researching like a volcanic event, what do you do to kind of research that kind of social or historical element? What are you really focusing on? Because it's not just kind of like the causes and the impacts, there's a bit more of a focus. So would you mind telling us a bit more about the in-depth research for any of the volcanic events that you've kind of looked at?
Yes. So anthropology is essentially the study of people and their behaviors. And for this context, for example, for St. Vincent, it's more of how what knowledge they had prior to the event happening. If there was knowledge there, how did they use it to respond and understand what was happening, and then see how they learned from that eruption, and then how they did adaptations to prepare essentially for the next one. So it's basically these sequences of events, and looking at using letters. So I use mainly archives, because these are rather historical eruptions now. So I use kind of letters, just to understand what were people seeing and how they described it and interpreted what they're seeing. And also just the reactions of what was happening. And also how things were damaged, and like how would they get about building stuff again so they can continue living in society again. And I have done interviews, because in 1979 eruptions doing living memory. So I did interviews, and for those I focused on how they responded to this happening. Mainly because there's this term that a kind of like a concept that is used called the mismatch effect, and that is how depending on where you're geographically located, you experience the same event differently, and this is for geohazards, so for not just for volcanic eruptions but for earthquakes, tsunamis and landslides as well. So depending on where you are, you experience the event differently. And those interviews, I went throughout the island talking to different people that were close to the volcano, people that were further away from the volcano, just to kind of like show the evidence that this event was the same. It impacted locations a little bit differently, but because of who these people are, like they had different jobs, different kind of like family units, kind of different access to resources and stuff. How they responded differently, that was just kind of like reinforcing the argument that why looking at the social perspective is important, because it's not all the same. You can't make predictions and understand how society responds, because people are just so different, and the volcano influences that as well, in terms of how far away or how close they were as well.
That's really interesting, because one thing which is a kind of a danger, which we talk quite a lot about at school, is kind of that like single story. And like we look at, say, even if you're looking at the earthquake in Haiti, that is discussed a lot for kind of GCSE and A Level, you kind of look at the impacts, so you kind of see that population as one. And I think that kind of mismatch effect we were talking about actually is quite a good way of actually making students really think about, actually, but just because this happened doesn't mean everybody was homeless in that way, or maybe some people were more affected for longer times as well. So I think that's actually a really interesting thing for A-level students, if you're listening, to maybe go and think about as well. So you kind of talked about some different data that you use. So would you say, do you mainly use qualitative research? We also kind of talked about this at A-level, and historical archives. Do you ever use kind of the science, like actual like data and maps as well to do with it?
Yes, so I do use, the core of the data is qualitative, but I reinforce that data with the quantitative data. So I do use a lot of maps. I've actually created a lot of maps myself based on that qualitative data. And kind of like statistics in terms of what was damaged, and like the finances, how that impacted kind of like the economy. Also, there is a lot of the kind of like the knowledge in how these physical processes work. So that does require an understanding of physics, in particular how it interacts with the environment. So topography. So I have a good understanding of how topography works in relation to how these hazards work. And it's essentially finding ways to piece this all together, because you can't have the social without the physical, you can't have the physical without the social. So bringing that all together in that kind of way. But there are others that can do this, and also linked to like the kind of like the chemistry and the physics of actually what the volcano was doing. And that's very interesting, and that's what's interesting about volcanology, that you can approach it so differently depending on your backgrounds.
Brilliant, because that's actually what some students say to me, is they either say, oh, I am a physical geographer, or I'm a human geographer. And particularly when people say, oh, I'm a human geographer, because I mainly teach that for A-level, I'm like, but actually it's all like tectonics and so many different like natural disasters. It's all about, as you said, the people and how they're impacted as well. So it's actually sometimes not like dangerous to split it into human and physical, but it is so kind of merged, which is why I think what you're doing is so interesting. But you have gone beyond kind of your research and gone into from the field to maybe more virtual worlds as well. So kind of how have you combined kind of your interest in pastime in like kind of video games? Why did you become interested in volcanoes to do with video games?
Yeah, so it's not really much of a secret, but I'm a big video gamer. And I was playing the Spyro the Dragon Reignited trilogy, so kind of like the remastered version. And I was playing in a level where there was quite a lot of lava falls. And in the real world, lava falls are actually quite rare. But in video games, it turns out they're quite popular. And I was just running around and just looking at it and comparing it to what I know how these things work in real life, and I was just like, it doesn't look quite right, the physics of it, and that just got me curious, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to go through every single level in all three Spyro games and look at the volcanism in each level and see how accurate it is compared to what we see in real life. And that expanded to doing other video games. It also involved a friend of mine who at the time was a master's geology student who is now doing a PhD in volcanology, But he also like was like, this is really cool. Let's see what we can do with this. So we just basically reviewed a bunch of games. We just played a bunch of games, and I looked at the volcanism in it and just see how that compares to real life and whether it matches up or doesn't. And I suppose it was just like scientific curiosity, and of course our understanding and what we know how volcanoes and the volcanic hazards work, and be like, does this actually match what we see in video games, and can we then turn that into a teaching opportunity? Because these resources, that means that they're available to teach people about how volcanic hazards behave or don't behave. And that's something like, well, actually, that's an outreach opportunity. That's a teaching opportunity. If you can get your hands on, like, there's like quite a few cheap games you can get on computers. It's like, well, what if like a teacher that wants to show how volcanic hazards work, why not bring it into the classroom by getting this video game that maybe lots of students know about, and get them to play it or watch someone play it and then do like homework on it in terms of, or actually, does this match with what you've been learning in class? Is this what, if you go online and like type in the type of hazard this is on YouTube, for example, what comes up? And then do a comparison between two, and that way you can learn what essentially what is correct or what isn't correct. And I think that's like really interesting way, and it's like an untapped resource, because how many people play video games? A lot of people play video games, and like kids and teenagers and whatnot, they play loads of video games. And it's like, well, that's one way you can engage with students to understanding how these different hazards work. And yeah, and it was just fun to do, and I still do it every now and then, take pictures of what I see. So yeah,
that sounds like a really great, I feel like, to all the teachers out there, get your video gaming on and see if you can try. Do you think, or do you not think it, I really liked how you said what you can see whether it's correct or incorrect. Do you think it's a danger if volcanoes are portrayed incorrectly in video games?
It can be if those inaccuracies are not addressed. So for example, one typical thing you see in video games is how runny and fluid lava flows are, like they almost behave like water, and that does not reflect what we see in real life. Yes, you can get these fast lava flows, but there's still other types of lava flows as well, and those other types of lava flows are not portrayed, and that can give this misconception that every volcano, for one, produces lava flows, but not all of them do. So like the volcano I researched, for example, in St. Vincent, doesn't produce lava flows, or doesn't produce lava flows that travel very far. But in video games, you constantly see that. Like with every volcano, that's like the signature. It's like, this is a volcano because there's lava. So I think it can be a danger if those inaccuracies are not addressed, or I don't know, whether you're curious enough to actually find out more yourself. But of course, at the end of the day, we made this argument that, of course, these video games, they're for entertainment, they're not there to educate. So they're not going to necessarily tell you that this is made up. So it's interesting to actually take it in the other way, that these inaccuracies can actually teach you that, okay, tell us what's wrong with it, and why isn't this correct, sort of thing. And that's like a teaching moment in itself, to be like, well, actually, I know what they look like because I was taught this, or I looked this up myself. And that's what that's, if you're curious enough about it, then you would do your own research about it. I mean, I definitely have done a lot of research because I, like historical kind of like fact-based games. I like to actually, because I am that person, I like to see like, who is this person that they mentioned in this game? And it's like, why are they important? And you can do that similar with volcanoes. Like, okay, is this lava flow what I see in real life? And so, what does it look like in real life? Are they just making it up, or is this always the case? So, it can be good and bad things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. As we're talking about lava flows, and I want to say, if anybody does have any questions for Jazmin, please do write them in the chat. But lava flows, I was thinking about this as you were saying, how lava can flow really slowly, and when we look at videos of it with GCSE students, the kind of big questions come up are, how do you think, and maybe from your work before, I'm putting you on the spot with this, are maybe some good ways to actually protect societies from volcanic activities? Because sometimes it's easier to see the earthquake protections in strong buildings or different materials, but actually in terms of volcanoes, have you found anything from your research on the best ways to protect societies?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, because most of the time it's down to land use planning, but you can't just, for example, there's quite a few arguments that, well, why can't they just up and move? And like move entire town or a village or even a city to another location. In some places you can't do that. Imagine the financial kind of like cost of moving an entire town to a different location. Most of the times there is not a different location available. So that argument in a sense is kind of redundant. And think about if you're a person and you're being told you need to move, imagine how you would feel about that. You'd be like, well, no, I've lived here all my life, why should I? And there's this thing in kind of like more cultural geography called like sense of place. It's like you feel like rooted in where you live and where you grew up, and it's like, no, I'm not going to do that. And these are arguments that people have. It's like, well, no, I'm not moving because I live here. And they just say, we'll just live with the volcano. And it is tricky because the power that these volcanic hazards have, it just overwhelms infrastructure. And it's interesting the different ways people have tried to. So there's some engineering techniques that have been successful, some haven't, in diverting lava flows. So recent example, the volcanic eruption that's currently happening in Iceland. Earlier on in the eruption, they actually did a very big ditch to actually divert some of the lava flow because it was going to a potentially dangerous location. So they actually just dug a ditch to create like a new channel for that lava to go down. There's been examples for Mount Etna in Sicily of like using concrete blocks, and that was not successful because the lava flow just went over it and engulfed it. So there's quite a lot of engineering options that sometimes have worked, but it is mainly for lava flows, just create a ditch, and that's all you can do. For buildings, you can't, there's nothing that can withstand the bulldozing power of a lava flow. So most of the research is, the priority is evacuation, because at the end of the day, the preservation of life is more important than materialistic kind of like possessions. But of course, there is still the conflict between that, because, for example, like the sense of place things, there might be the only home they've lived in, and all their possessions and memories are in that house, and that gets destroyed, and obviously that can have an impact on people. So with volcanoes, it's all about just management and just resilience, and having the science as up to date as possible to know when something might happen and getting people out of the way. Unfortunately, it's trickier compared to other hazards because society has just grown around these volcanoes. Sometimes they have not even erupted for thousands of years, but still could have the potential to erupt in the future. And we just have to find ways to live with that.
Can you? I know you talked about the ditches. Can soil also be used to divert, or is that not strong enough? No. Soil just gets engulfed. This is the problem. Like these lava flows, they're just so strong. Like, because if you think about it, it's molten rock, and rock is tough. And in this case, it's very hot. So no, soil itself cannot do that. There was actually when was it? It was in Iceland in 1970s. Cannot remember the name of the volcano at the top of my head.
But this volcano erupted essentially on an island of Iceland, which is and the lava flow was approaching the harbour, and that was the only way you could get in and out of this island. They actually managed to just dump loads of seawater on it, and eventually cooled down and stopped, like very close to the harbour, because. But they could do that because they also had an endless supply of water, so they could keep on dumping water on it. But that was a rare case that water actually did its job and cooled it down quick enough, which what we call quenching in volcanology. But not everywhere has an endless supply of water and able to do that. So it is very hard to stop these flows. And that's also just one type of hazard. Other hazards you can't even stop at all.
Yeah.
So
would that be the ash?
You just have to find ways of living with it. Yeah. Yeah.
We actually got a question that's coming, so I'm going to ask this now before I go on to my other questions, because it links with it as we're talking about it. Saying how hard is it to like computer simulate the lava flows in real life, or to know where the safe zones are? Because we've kind of said how. I mean, you said how it's difficult to kind of like know, and even like lava you might be able to know, but not the other hazards. So how hard is that?
It would be hard for me because I'm not trained to do it, but this is where it's really interesting. You can have different approaches to discipline. So there's mathematicians and computer scientists that can actually model how these lava flows behave. And I know plenty of mathematicians that do that, and that's their research. They computer model these things. So it is possible if you're trained in it. So for me, for example, I would find it near impossible to do, but I know people that can do that. And we usually know where things go in the environment because there have been geological studies to find those geological deposits of these volcanic hazards, because they do leave quite I wouldn't say unique signatures in the like the topography, but we can find out from like the geological knowledge, like what does a lava flow, solidified lava flow look like, for example, and we use those. So we use kind of like the geological record, and this is where also we do use the human record. So these interviews and archives to tell us where these happened in the past, because that helps us inform the present and also the future. So quite a lot of volcanologists, they're actually trained in mapping as well, because that's a very key skill in understanding where everything is. And we use that, and this, like civil engineers, they use those maps we produce to be like, okay, what can we do to plan, where things are, if we can move them or find different ways to change the structure of it, or just retrofit it in some way. So it is possible if you are interested in maths or physics or computer modeling. So this is where it's really interesting, the different ways you can approach the subject.
Yeah, brilliant. And how it's so important, as you said, for kind of both of them, particularly if you can't actually reduce the actual physical impact of volcanoes, knowing that as much as you can preparation before.
Yes.
On to your amazing podcast, What on Earth, which you host with Nuzhat, and is on Apple Podcast, but I don't know if you want to plug where else it is as well. But you
I'll let this one.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. And you host a range of different people from kind of STEM distant subjects, and talk about kind of decolonizing, and you host a range of academics from a range of different backgrounds. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe your favorite podcast that maybe people should go out, your episode that people should go out and listen to first, or just a bit about it, just to get people interested and where they can find it?
Okay. Yeah. So not only Apple, but it's most podcast listening apps. So like Spotify, Amazon Music, most places you could think of, it's on. And And so the podcast, so my co-host, Nuzhat Tabassum, she's a geologist who looked at diamonds, which is pretty cool in itself. But it was more just interesting that, yes, there are like geography and earth science podcasts out there, but they just kind of like talk about science and not the people behind the science, which we feel is just as important. So on the basis of that and the fact that we know that the earth sciences is the least ethnically diverse discipline, not just in the UK, but pretty much almost around the world, we wanted to show that it's not just the stereotypical kind of like, earth sciences you think of, which most people think of, a white man in a lab coat or like with a beard and stuff like that. So we want to show that we all look very different and we all do really interesting things. We've just, from people we know and people who've requested to us, we find earth scientists from all different walks of backgrounds. We also just talk to people in STEM in general as well, because they also have very interesting perspectives to talk about. And I don't know, it's really hard to say where to start, because they're all just individually, each of the episodes are just so different and really exciting conversations. So I suppose I'll start from the first episode. The first episode was with a micropaleontologist. Looking at kind of like microfossils. And in particular for their research, they were looking at using microfossils to see this one particular climate event that was like really short, that happened. And it was just amazing to find out how that's even possible. You can use microfossils to find out what past climate looked like. And that's what I really like about each guest, because they talk about things that I know nothing about. So I'm like learning with them as well as like the listener. I suppose one episode that really did fascinate me was talking to an ecologist who specializes in the word escapes me. Land management. Let's just say land management. But they're looking at perspective how fire and wildfires it used to be an effective tool to manage land, but how that's kind of gotten out of control. So they wanted to find, like, is it possible to, sustainably reintroduce fire to places that no longer have fire? This was in the United States, and they were based in Michigan. But what was great about them is they actually originally from they're Mexican American, so getting their perspective of interaction with indigenous populations and Native Americans, being a Mexican, and just their journey, because we like to ask each guest, like, how did you get into where you are today? And it's just really fascinating how different backgrounds and everything like that. So each episode is great to learn about the science they do and about them as a person. And yeah, we also try to include a little bit of like EDI stuff as well, and around about ideas about decolonization, because most of our guests, they in some way or form do that in their work and kind of like outside of work as well. So really interesting, like it's not just science, there's so much more to a person, but most of the time, most of our guests, they've been known for their EDI work and not the science. So we wanted to focus on their science, because it's what usually sometimes can happen. It's like if you're known as like the EDI person, you kind of forget that they're a scientist as well, and they do their own research as well. So we wanted to kind of like merge those two together and not just put them in boxes.
Brilliant. And one topic which you was, I think, on one of the latest episodes I've just listened to, and it kind of feeds into our next one, my final question to you on careers, but you had a really good discussion on, do you have to be smart to do STEM subjects, and I wondered if you could share your view on that, because sometimes I see as a teacher students say, oh, I can't do this, or I'm not clever enough. What do you think about do you need to be smart to do sciences?
I think that's untrue. Like for me, for example, I was a very average student in school and at university, very average. Like I did not stand out in terms of marks or even class or whatnot. For me, it was just, I really enjoyed learning, and I had just had that fascination. Particularly, I was really hooked and in school in geography and science. I did triple A science and like geography, and I was just learning about, for me in geography, just learning about the world and how it works and how people live in the world. I just really found that really fascinating. And for me, I've if you have a curiosity and you like asking questions, then STEM might be for you. You know, and you don't have to be super smart to do it. Of course, you need to know things, but you know, that's not the be end all, and it can be intimidating, being surrounded by people who aren't smart, but you're just as capable in your own right compared to those who are seen as smart, because you're smart in your own way. For example, like me, for example, I feel like I'm smart in understanding how natural hazards impact people, but then there's like people I know who like I see as like mega smart, because they understand how the geology and like the rocks and like the chemistry and like the physics work. And like, for example, when I'm at these conferences and I hear them, I'm like, I don't understand what is going on, but it looks really cool. And I think everyone is, you know, different, and I think that's more important, the fact that you have those questions and you are different and you are curious. So even if you don't think you're smart, you're smarter than you think.
That's a great answer, and all about asking questions. On the Curious Geographer, just be curious. That's the kind of main line.
Yes, exactly.
So leading on to that, you you completed your PhD and kind of looking into doing kind of hopefully more kind of funded research as well. So how did you get to where you are? I know you talked about where you did your undergraduate and masters. So a bit about kind of your career path, and then what do you have? You've already given some fantastic advice for students, as in kind of follow your interests, but what do you have any particular like career advice or university advice for students who are making those next steps?
Yes, so like I said, so for me, I did kind of like a traditional path of going from undergraduate to master's to PhD. You don't have to do that. First off, I suppose that's my first advice. You don't have to do it. You certainly don't have to do it back to back either, because that's what I did. I feel like I regretted that because I didn't have that time to have a break and maybe do something else. I did, however, at my undergrad, it was a 4-year course, and one of those years was doing a work placement, and I valued that experience. Particularly, I was a student at the time who hadn't had a proper paid job before, because I have a disability, so that made it hard for me to get work that suited my physical needs. But I wanted that experience to work. So I ended up being a teaching assistant in Wales for a year, and I value that experience. And for that, for undergrad, that made me realize that, I really like learning about natural hazards. So when I came to the end of my undergrad, I was thinking, well, I like natural hazards. I'm not ready yet to go into the big wide world of work. I want to learn more. So I was actually talking to my family about this. And I was like, what about volcanoes? Volcanoes seem pretty cool. And this is when my mom said, talk to your granddad. He's from a volcanic island. And I was like, is he? So I spoke to my granddad, and this is when I was introduced to the fantastic world of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the volcano La Soufrière. And that's when I was just like, that's really cool. I want to learn more. In particular, in my last year of my undergrad, I had a module called community resilience. So understanding how people essentially live with natural hazards and like how that works like at a community level. And I was like, I want to do more of that, but focus on volcanoes. So I went searching. At the time, there was only two kind of like volcanology master's courses, one at Lancaster, one at Portsmouth. Eventually, I ended up going to Lancaster. And this was mainly because of the lecturers there, because they do some really interesting research on, it's more of like volcano and ice stuff. So quite a lot of the researchers go to Iceland and to other like locations that have ice-capped volcanoes. And I just found that really fascinating, that interaction between hot and cold and fire and water. And I really wanted to learn more about that, as well as just in general know about volcanoes more for a scientific academic perspective. And then it came to like my dissertation, and how it usually works is lecturers provide the list of research that they have ongoing and might need help with. And I found it funny because I was looking through the list and I was like, I can't do any of them, because these lecturers were mainly mathematicians, physicists, and chemists. And while I felt I was good at chemistry and biology, not so much physics, I hadn't done that since school, because I went 4 years in geography, not doing much of that. I did some chemistry for like environmental stuff, but nothing hardcore that these lecturers wanted. So I was like, okay, what can I do? And this is when I thought back to my stuff in undergrad, thinking more about the social side. In particular, one of my lecturers said, and that has kept in my mind, that it's not a hazard about the people. So I was like, okay, it's not a hazard about people, and for what I've been taught so far, they have not included the people that much. So I was like, well, no, I want to focus on how people live with volcanoes. And this is what led me to proposing my own project and focusing on the people of St. Vincent, but doing a volcanic risk perception study. And risk perceptions essentially is how people think about the hazards they live with, and how that translates into how prepared you are, and kind of like how do you interact with people, with like local authorities that are there to keep you safe from these hazards. So I designed that project myself with guidance from a lecturer who was my supervisor. And what was interesting with that is I had a physical volcanologist as my main supervisor, but then my second supervisor was a human geographer, because I was essentially doing a questionnaire and interview, and I had not done that for a very long time. So I needed that guidance, and it was really actually good to have his input, because that really made me think more like, how do people live in their dangerous environment? And essentially I did that. I managed to go to the Caribbean by myself for a whole month and to do this research with help from family and family friends, because I still have family over in St. Vincent, and just going through the process of writing this thing. So that's why I say that you can go and do a PhD if you want to, straight from undergrad, because there are these programs that are a bit longer that are designed to have kind of like a foundation year and then attached on as a PhD. But for me, the master's was a good example of how to write like a scientist, essentially. Like, yes, I did learn that in undergrad, but master's level really helped me refine that process. And at the end of the project, I got the results back. I surprisingly got one of the highest marks out of not only my cohort that were also on the master's course, but also out of the whole department, so the Lancaster Environment Centre. And the main reason for that is because I designed the project myself and drove it myself. So I suppose that is one idea, one advice I have is like, if you have an idea, stick with it. Just ask these questions, or what if we look at things this way? And then you can work with an academic to actually refine those ideas and then follow them up. And just, keep on with the curiosity. And this is where the course director actually encouraged me, is like, you would be great doing a PhD and doing research in volcanoes, because this work was great and you were a great student. I was still kind of average, but they were still like, you're still a great student. So this led me to applying for different PhDs. And I applied to several, but eventually led to the University of Hull. And the main reasons why I chose them is because of the people who would be my supervisors. Because these academics were very knowledgeable in their fields. And I, for one, I read their work as well as an undergrad. So I was like, whoa, I get to work with someone that I've actually used as my, in my assignments. That's pretty cool. So my first supervisor is a physical volcanologist. So they specialize in volcanic hazards. They're actually also a geochemist as well. So they do the chemistry of these hazards and the geology and stuff as well. My second supervisor was actually an environmental historian. So I worked with an historian. And then my third supervisor was a human and cultural geographer who specialized in feminist geographies. So I had a volcanologist, an historian, and a human geographer essentially as the people who were supervising me. And this really is where I don't know, where I kind of blossomed, I suppose, in terms of an academic, because I had the opportunity to do something that I really wanted to do, and be paid for it, because you do get paid to be a PhD student. That's another advice. If you want to do a PhD down the line, make sure it has funding attached to it. Because there are some PhDs that they say it's self-funded, but it's expensive to self-fund. So if you have that money yourself, great. If not, make sure it has funding. And I've kind of lost track of what the original question was.
Well, you've given us lots you've given as an amazing, we can actually kind of see where your, how you interpret volcanoes actually coming from maybe the different influences that you've had as people who have kind of been, it's not mentoring, what are your supervisors, those kind of different lenses. Yeah. So it kind of makes sense now, kind of maybe some of the ideas that you've taken on when you're researching volcanoes. So the kind of final thing, I know you've given some little advice along the way, but do you have kind of any top tips? I think you've been giving advice throughout this whole interview, but any other further top tips for students who are kind of making those next steps in decision?
Yeah, okay. I would say if you if you know, for example, me, just ask me advice. So in what you want to do. Because I have unofficially mentored students who are also A-level geography students into choosing the right course for them to develop the skills they want and do the research they want. So, for example, it was a few years ago, and I can't remember how it happened, but I think it was I did something for the BBC, and my best friend, who was a doctor, they were like a medical doctor. They were really excited and showed it to a colleague of theirs. And the colleague was like, oh, my daughter's really interested in volcanoes and she's going to be deciding where to go to university. Is it okay if I, get my daughter to talk to me? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And we had this conversation over email about what she wanted to do. And then I helped guide her eventually to choosing a geoscience course at Royal Holloway University in London. And now she's in her final year doing her final year project. doing what she wants to do, and she's actually combined she's more interested in more the geochemistry side of things. So she's trained up to be a geochemist for our undergrad. And yes, so like being mentored if you can, and feel confident enough, because obviously I understand that it might be rather intimidating, but reach out to someone in the field if you're like, well, I want to be a volcanologist. There are, for example, on Twitter, loads of volcanologists. So it's not just me you can ask advice from. Like, if you want to, I can put you in touch with loads of volcanologists. And that's something that teachers can do as well. You can ask your teacher, oh, do you know someone I could talk to because I want to do this? And most of the time, they're like, yes, I know someone. And it's usually through Twitter that they know someone. So yeah, if you want to have advice from someone who actually does what you want to do, we're more than happy to talk to you. And I for one thing just love it as well. Just like, it's particularly seeing students from A Level, get to where they want to get to. And I think that's really lovely. So seek out, advice from those who are actually doing what you want to do. Because we're actually a rather friendly bunch. Like we.
That's brilliant. That's really good.
Yeah, I would say also another thing is don't be afraid to make mistakes. Particularly, if you do go to university, your coursework and your assignments you got to do, particularly in the first year, it is a big leap from A-level geography into undergrad, and that's okay. The first year, how courses are devised is in the first year of your course, they are designed to get everyone on the same kind of like level in terms of the skills you need to know to take into your second year, into your final year. And it's okay to make mistakes because you will learn from those mistakes, because academics who mark your work, they provide feedback to help you improve, particularly your writing, or if it's a practical, because in geography at university, there's lots of practicals and how to use equipment and stuff to take measurements and stuff they can use in finding a project. So it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to ask for help or for clarification. That's what we're there for. That's what academics are there for. They're here to help you become what you want to be. And again, they're more than willing to help. So it can be intimidating, but they're a friendly bunch, and that's what they're there for, to help you. What other advice? Maybe, okay, this is probably a bit personal for me in terms of this might not work for you, but if you do go to university or wherever you decide to go, make friends with people who are not on your course. If you go to university, mainly because you get so many different perspectives. Like I was friends with people that did sports science, and I learned about things I never thought I'd know about, how it works, sports science works. I didn't even know it was a thing, but apparently it's a thing. I am friends with people who like work in musical theatre, and there's just so many people out there. And the good thing about university is you get to meet so many different people. Like I'm friends with people who are originally from all around the world. Like I'm good friends with someone who has moved back to Portugal now, and we talk and whatnot. And it was a really nice cultural exchange because she was over in the UK, and I've only been to Portugal like once, so it was really interesting to like both of us learn from one another as well. And yeah, like, I'm good friends with someone who's from Greece, and all over the world. And I think that's beautiful that you can meet different people, just widening perspectives. And if you do get to stage eventually you want to be a researcher, particularly in volcanology, you can end up in the most amazing places. I have been to Italy a number of times. I ended up doing research in Denmark, which I thought would never happen, but I ended up in Denmark for a while. I went to a conference all the way in South America, in Chile, and saw volcanoes up close. They weren't doing anything, but I saw kind of like the volcanoes you learn about basically in the textbooks and whatnot. I got to see them in real life. I have loads of friends and collaborators in the US, in New Zealand, in the Caribbean, everywhere. And like I get in touch with African geologists. I was like, it's amazing, and just getting to know how research is done in other countries and work with them. It's just I really enjoy that. So if that's for you, if you like meeting new people, then if you want to go into academia, you'll get the opportunity to do that. But I think I'll end on that. It's okay if you don't want to go into academia, and it's okay if you don't want to go to university. It's a personal choice, and you can still get fulfilling life not going to university. So it's totally your choice.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that advice, because it is so hard, students feeling like they've kind of got the weight of the world on their shoulders, trying to make decisions and kind of knowing how to like navigate through the next stages. So kind of what you've given. And that final note as well, that not everyone has to go to university, but you have given some fantastic tips for those who are planning on going to university. Well, that kind of takes us to the end. I feel like I should get you to speak to all future students about to go to university, though, because you've given some fantastic advice. And I think that anybody who's on the edge of doing something to do with kind of tectonics or hazards and university degree courses, I think people will be very convinced. You're making me want to go back and do an undergraduate on it. Do you have anything? I put your link to the podcast in the chat. Is there anything that you finally want to plug, or just kind of go to the podcast, everybody, and check that out? You also have a website as well.
Yeah, I suppose my blog, where it used to be mainly kind of like writing my process doing the PhD, but now it has evolved to just reviewing volcanoes and video games. So, so PhD Volcanology.wordpress.com. That's where myself and sometimes my friend Ed McGowan, we review a video game that has volcanoes in it and see how accurate it is or not. That's kind of the only thing. And if you are on Twitter or planning to go on Twitter eventually, I'm at Scarlett_Jazmin. And I think if you use Twitter correctly, it can be very useful to connect with different people. So for me, for example, I connect with loads of different scientists. And that's how I got the opportunities I had. And that's how students who are probably in your position have got in contact with me, asking for advice. And yeah, there's, for example, a lot of volcanologists around the world, because actually we're quite a small community. Most of them are actually on Twitter, so that's rather useful as well if you're interested in volcanology. But other hazards as well, so like seismologists and like hydrologists, like most of them use Twitter to talk about their research and whatnot.
Well, I will put those links into the comments section as well. So from all of us in the Curious Geographer, thank you so much for taking up your time to speak to us. It has been really, really fascinating. And from all of the kind of Curious Geographers, people watching, we wish you the best of luck finding your new kind of research project. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And just to let everybody else know, thank you everybody for watching. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with an amazing interview, and it will be a new schedule as well. So I hope you guys are all dry after a pretty rainy day where I am. But yeah, I hope you're all well as well, and looking forward to this time. We've got really, really fantastic guests coming on as well. So that's it from me. Have a lovely rest of your evening.